and welcome back to the Places We'll Go show. It's just such a privilege to have everybody coming back, listening time and time again. We thank you for all the amazing feedback that Richie and I pick up in between times. Today, very special guest today. Margaret, fantastic to have you with us.
Delighted, and hello from New York.
Indeed, yes. So this is a rare treat to talk to somebody stateside. And Margaret, I should introduce you because maybe some people won't be aware of you, even if they should. So Margaret Molloy, a glittering career, and actually, frankly, one of the most respected people in the industry globally, held many very senior marketing roles, and perhaps most notably, until recently, was spent over a decade as Global CMO at Siegel+Gale, based out of New York. Just for those who don't know Siegel+Gale, one of the world's top branding agencies, part of the Omnicom Group, 5,000 clients, 70 countries, and more or less you rocked it there for a decade, which is amazing. And so can't really say too much. There until recently, as I mentioned, watch this space for the next big thing. Beyond Siegel+Gale, also, I know you have a very entrepreneurial streak. It caught my eye that for the last 8 years, you founded and are running Wearing Irish. People will have already picked up that Irish lilt, which I personally love, trying to help Irish fashion break into the US, which is fantastic. You've had other board roles. You are also yourself a podcaster, no pressure on Richie and I. A massive experience to bring along. Always engaging and inspiring. I know this is going to be a great episode for our guests. So fabulous to have you with us, Margaret.
Delighted to be here. I am an avid listener, so I look forward to being on the hot seat.
Dun, dun, dun. I'll tell you what, when we're talking about announcing New York, I couldn't help but think of the Sting song, the Englishman in New York, but Irish woman in New York, maybe. I don't know. There we are. That's my cheesiness coming out on a Friday afternoon where we're sitting in London. But Margaret, just wonderful to have you on. And just kick off. So how are you feeling? How are you doing? How's NYC?
I am feeling very well. Thank you for the question. It's always nice to start with that question. And one of my own personal favorites because I love to ask questions. Very well and very excited for spring. I'm having a little spring in my step and the weather here is glorious. There's a lot of possibilities in the air.
Ooh, yes. New dawn. So what specifically does spring bring for you in your routines or, the things you get up to?
Well, spring is about, for me, another opportunity for reflection. There are times in the year when I reflect, take stock and reappraise. Spring is one of them. Back to school, the beginning of the new school year is another. And those are periods when I ask of myself, how am I doing? Along the lines of Rishi's question, but very profoundly, what am I contributing to my community? How am I doing from a family, values, balancing my life perspective? And really importantly for me, what am I learning? You spoke of renewal and possibilities I talked about. Well, to me, it's all about learning. What do I want to learn this spring?
Wow. I mean, I love that thought and I love the periodicness that you come at it from, right? And that sort of sense of spring and renewal and possibility, and then thereafter a sense of needing to learn and contribute. It's just brilliant. So what is the priority in terms of learning over the next kind of period for you?
There are certainly tactical things I want to learn more about. I'm sure all of my peers in marketing want to dig deeper into the tools and technologies of AI. I certainly propose to learn more about that. But that's almost like a channel learning or a tactical learning. I want to learn, I'm working on it, and I think deeply about it, how to be a better listener. I've spent a lot of my time asking questions, and that has helped me build some listening muscle. But I find that at this stage in my life, and ironically, it's in this context of a conversation where I'm positioned, if you will, as the expert, we find ourselves providing advice, providing perspective, shared experiences. And the tendency and the risk is to forget to listen. And I believe listening, obviously it's context dependent, but is the most generous gift you can give to someone. And through listening, you learn. don't learn as much talking to yourself or when you're talking, but asking questions of others, listening deeply and listening for the cues that are not necessarily limited to the words. Our culture, and particularly our career stage, lends itself to a lot of telling and a lot of answering, and therefore assuming knowledge and assuming expertise. And I believe those are dangerous qualities. So I'm endeavouring, and it's work in progress, to become a much more active listener and to lead with questions. So very prescient of you to start asking me how I'm doing, because I'm hoping to do a better job in asking that of others.
Well, that is profound. Just to be clear, in this moment, you can say whatever you want. We do the listening, you do the talking. But I love that. But I do happen to say, Margaret, I've seen you host panels where you are a very deep listener. So for me, this is not very good to good. This is good to great in terms of you as a listener. But I'm going to pick up on the Irish woman in New York line from Richie. So tell us how that happened.
So I left college and was invited by the Irish government to pursue a 1-year internship in New York City. Mm-hmm. I spoke Spanish, and there was an awareness of the importance of the Spanish language broadly in the United States, and perhaps that was the reason they chose me. I really respect their wisdom, because the recruiters there saw something in me that suggested the United States would be the right place to plant this little flower, if you will. Mm. And I had never been to America. I had only been to Spain. I grew up very modestly and the eldest of 6, so holidays were not on the agenda for our family. And perhaps unknown to them, the United States had very little allure in my family, because my grand-aunt, my father's aunt, passed away on the Titanic. And so there's a certain shadow or surrounding America for our family. But to me, that was intriguing. I really felt that she left. She was in her early 20s, around the same age I was when I finished college and went to America. She never made it, of course, but I felt a sense of her ambition. And I also felt a sense of deep privilege, because I had assets she did not. I had a college education. I had certain skills that were honed that were not at her disposal, and a deep sense of opportunity, possibility, but also privilege to perhaps live some of her ambitions. Her ambition was to be a maid in a grand house in America. And in those days, given her station in life, that was a very laudable ambition. And of course, here am I, decades later, living in New York, loving it and finding it to be a wonderful fit for my personality.
Wow, Margaret, what a story there. And I'm sorry to hear about your great aunt. But as you say, what you've been able to take from her legacy was reviving you in being able to then fulfill some of that all those decades later. Gosh, quite amazing. I mean, do you think what do you think the role of family ties or some sort of legacy, as it were, to kind of fulfill that? Did that really motivate you? Was it part of the thought around the States for you?
It was probably subconscious, to be honest, Rishi. But I think what's interesting is being an immigrant, actually, in any environment, gives you a different set, I believe, of perspectives and skills. If we think of it purely from an evolutionary perspective, you take a thing, a living creature, and you transplant it into another environment. A set of instincts take shape. You become very aware of your environment. Your curiosity is piqued. It's almost a survival instinct. You are at a state of alert. You take nothing for granted in terms of your surroundings. And that mindset and that muscle that you build I believe lends itself very well to careers in sales and marketing and leadership more broadly, because you don't take anything for granted. You're constantly alert, perceiving cues in your environment, which means in the context of a meeting, you're aware of body language. You're aware of how people are responding. You're also very aware of your own place. And there's no sense of entitlement that comes with that. And I do not believe that's uniquely my skill. I think that's a set of sensibilities that immigrants or those who are in one environment that's not the one they grew up in and that is not familiar naturally develop as a set of survival skills. It's almost what the psychologists might call deeper introspective sense. You're more aware of your body. And words have a role where you think of your mind not just as your brain, but your body and how you're feeling and being in touch with your gut. And I think there's power in that, and the ability to be intentional about it is something I've endeavored to try.
I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Nobody's ever made the link that I've heard that, by origin, you were an outsider looking in, which is always a good vantage point for a marketer. Let's go into the marketing thing. So what was the 1-year assignment in marketing? What's the ... that got you to have a career in marketing?
I was invited to represent Ireland as part of Enterprise Ireland's internship program, where they took 20 enthusiastic young people and sent them to the four corners of the earth to tell the story of Ireland, ostensibly as interns doing research, equivalent to the US Department of Commerce or the Department of Trade, if you will. And I was there for a year, absolutely loved it. We talk about our visceral sense. The moment I got off that airplane in New York, I knew it was for me. The energy, the diversity, the population, it really sparked my curiosity. But it was a 1-year internship, and I wanted to stay and didn't have a visa. So I networked my way into a job with Eircom, Telecom Ireland, and spent 4 glorious years there telling a different dimension of the Irish story, one that's more about economic development, foreign direct investment, and promoting Ireland as a location for international call centres. And that was also a wonderful job because I'm very mission-driven. And the mission was to help create jobs for my fellow country people in Ireland. I could get behind that mission. And from a career perspective, Mark, it really fomented in me the recognition that in subsequent jobs, I had to get behind the mission. It mobilized me, and I wasn't about just a transactional relationship with employment. It was much deeper than that. And that's a very helpful filter for me when selecting jobs. Can I get behind the mission?
I think that's a wonderful filter there. And that probably takes us really nicely into the decade-long stint that you had with Siegel+Gale. Tell us a little bit more about that and perhaps some of the clients that you've worked with in and around that thought around driving and getting behind a mission.
Certainly. So I joined Siegel+Gale after spending more than a decade in client-side marketing roles, primarily at technology companies in the United States. And I chose the job because it answered a couple of questions for me. One, filter I always use when selecting jobs, mission, but also what can I learn? And I was at a point where I wanted to learn about branding and recognized that brands were becoming more important, and brand was becoming a more important asset for any business. And Siegel+Gale is a renowned branding agency. So it was that quest to learn about brand and go at the deep end, work for an agency that helps some of the world's top clients build their brands. Secondly, the mission. Siegel+Gale really believes that simple is smart, that we live in a complex world, and the brands that make it easy for all of us to buy from them can command our loyalty. And when I think about brand, Rishi, I think of it very expansively. It's not just the words, the pictures, the logo, but the entirety of the customer experience and, in fact, all stakeholder experience. So this mission that's very deep-rooted at Siegel+Gale around simplification was something I could get myself behind, and was privileged to fly that flag for the company for over a decade and meet wonderful people like Mark and introduce the right clients to the agency. My role personally was essentially Chief Marketing Officer of the firm, which meant bringing in new business, building the reputation of the firm. And for me, most important of all, I saw my role, and this may surprise you. Of course, there were tactics, lead generation, sales pitches, PR, etc. But the role for me was generating pride. I wanted all of my colleagues, all of our clients, all of the partners that we liaised with to be proud to be associated with Siegel+Gale. So that very simple framing or filter informed the choices I made around everything I did when I went to work every day for a decade there.
We should probably pick up on pride, but before we do that, you're very complimentary, by the way, very flattering complimentary, but to me, you are an excellent networker for all the right reasons, and it was probably implicit in your role at Siegel+Gale. But yes, I'd love to know a little bit more about, and not just for me, but for our listeners, some advice and tips on how to be an amazing networker.
I appreciate that observation, Mark, and I think it does come back to the very beginning. Rishi hit on it. I arrived in the United States knowing absolutely no one. So there is a survival component to it, first and foremost. And then there's an element of you get good at something and you enjoy it. And I'm very intentional about continuing it. So a couple of thoughts top of mind, Mark. First is being intentional about having a diverse network. Early in my career, my network was comprised of a few very finite tribes. There were Irish people, there were women, they were graduates of the Harvard Business School, where I had the privilege of spending 2 years, and they tended to be very homogenous. And then I sort of had this insight formed by a variety of events that informed me that I needed to diversify my network. Very, very quick story to make the point. A number of years ago, I was hosting an event in Boston, and I pride myself in having a great experience for our guests. Worked really hard and very intentionally on every detail. And we had a wonderful conversation. I had 4 CMOs split by gender, B2B, B2C, all well represented. Rich conversation around brand building, great engagement in the audience, and we as a team were quite self-congratulatory. And maybe there might have been some business because it was all in the service of winning the right business. So it checked all of the boxes, or so we thought. And I went back to my desk and I checked my email. And there was an email from one of my guests. And he said to me, "Margaret, thank you very much for hosting a spectacular event. The hospitality was wonderful. The food was excellent. However, if you thought that event represented the future of marketing, I'd like to suggest that you are sorely mistaken." And then I realized my guest was a man of color. My panel was for white professionals. And my first reaction, maybe again it's that animalistic instinct, was defensive. I said, well, it was a private event. He was in the room. Why didn't he speak up? I have a commercial agenda. That's what I'm trying to do. And then I paused. And then I said, my guest has just given me the most constructive piece of feedback I've ever received on networking, which is to say it was a blind spot. He revealed my blind spot. I was so focused on gender, I wasn't even thoughtful about representation of different lived experiences, different racial backgrounds. Years later, I've worked very intentionally to be curious about different lived experiences, and really proud to have a much more diverse network. I recently returned to Boston, met my friend. I was invited to be on a panel. I invited him to join me. He kindly accepted the invitation. And I asked him privately, why did you do that? Why did you invest in me like that? That was courageous. And his response was wonderful. He said, I saw in you someone who was going to be making a difference and convening, and I felt the need to share. But I was also paying it forward, because months previously, someone had taken him aside and highlighted that he was neglecting the LGBTQ community, that he was so focused on race, he missed the opportunity to think outside that one lens. So, long-winded way of saying, Mark, diversity is really important when thinking about networks. The other part is asking questions and really listening. And I'm always working on that. And I know for me personally, it's a work in progress. The tendency when we're networking is we are so enthusiastic, we want to tell our story. But in so doing, we can miss the opportunity to ask others for theirs. Now, you've institutionalized that practice in creating a podcast, but at a cocktail party and at events, I try hard to ask questions. What is interesting to you these days? I try not to lead with a classic American question of what do you do? Because that immediately takes it down a professional angle. The idea of listening is the most important skill in networking and the most underappreciated. We could say a lot about that. We have a finite set of time moments here. The final one I would say, Mark, on networking is following up. So many people I encounter neglect that aspect. And to the extent I've been successful in building a network, it's around that. It's the continuous engagement. It's keeping your promises, following up. So if I could limit it to 3 points, I would say diverse network, listening first, and following up when you meet people.
What a poignant 3 pieces of advice right there. And in fact, Margaret, you stole my question when you talked to the type of question that you would open up with at a networking event or a session, which isn't around being broad rather than being the atypical American question, as you put it, as such. And I love that thinking, keep it open, keep open-minded, and then listen in. I think that's a wonderful way to think about it. I'm going to recap and go back to what Mark alluded to in the previous segment, which is around generating pride. And how did you go about carving out, because actually Siegel+Gale is a special brand. And you're absolutely right. I think you fulfilled that notion of pride with everybody, from stakeholders, clients, employees, and the like. And I wondered if there's anything you could share on that front as to how you went about carving out such a wonderful position for that entity.
Well, I had the privilege when joining Siegel+Gale of joining an agency that already had a strong ethos and a point of view. And the point of view, as I mentioned, was around the superiority of simplicity. So the task at hand was essentially to lean into that in all its opportunities, taking simplicity from what might be a very abstract concept to making it truly tangible. I will give you one example. I believe that our minds and our brains privilege storytelling over fact-based perception or fact-based articulation of a point of view. One activity that I did, and we institutionalized it, is when hosting panels or events around the world, I invited all of our speakers to bring one physical object that manifests simplicity to them to the conversation. And I invited them to tell a story of the item they chose and why they chose it. And to create an air of youthfulness, but also playfulness to the conversation, I would ask and introduce by saying, this is the show and tell portion of the proceedings. And it brought everyone back to that sense of youth that was integral to learning. And then our guests talked about their objects and why they represent simplicity to them. It's a very small device, but it was illustrative of how I approach creating pride. It's taking something from abstract to making it tangible, inviting people to bring part of their own selves to the experience, bringing a physical object, trying to appreciate outside the mind, because as I mentioned earlier, I believe sometimes there's too much of a reliance on intellect, and trying to think outside of that, bringing physical object, connecting with people at a visceral level and providing opportunity for storytelling. So that is one example of many that illustrates the mindset that I brought to it.
Love that. I love the point about facts and stories. You reminded me, and this is a shout out to Joel Barnett, for those who know him. He told me about Adler, who you got Freud and you got Jung in terms of psychologists and psychoanalysts. And Adler says that we struggle to differentiate between facts and stories. And for the most time, we're translating our stories into a belief that they are facts. Won't go any deeper than that, but that really conjured some thoughts in my mind. But I'm going to go back to the point about simplicity. And can you name check some brands that you think have really cracked that in this ever more complex world that we live in?
Certainly. And I would refer your listeners to the Simplicity Index produced by Siegel+Gale. The study is produced every couple of years for the last decade, and I had the privilege of overseeing that study, the world's simplest brands. Brands that are done very well in the study include Google, Amazon, in the fast food category, McDonald's, in entertainment, Netflix. And those brands really, from our perspective, and certainly I had the privilege of interviewing many leaders of those brands, and my takeaway is they prioritize simplicity. It comes from the top. And they understand deeply that simplicity is not about being reductive. It's about getting to the essence. It's about that gorgeous intersection of clarity and surprise, surprising us as consumers with the lack of cognitive load required to buy from them. And I think the genius of those simplifiers is that they know what to strip away and what to leave behind. The tendency when one attempts to simplify can sometimes be to go for dull or boring if you over-index on clear. But no, the real simplifiers know where to bring the joy, know what to strip away. So those are among the brands that have typically done well in the study.
Clarity plus surprise in simplicity. Wonderful. What a wonderful, succinct way of putting it. Margaret, you come across as someone who clearly obviously had a formidable career, and I'm sure led and hired some wonderful teams through your time. And I just wonder, what advice would you give somebody who is looking to forge a successful career in our industry today?
So much on that, and thank you. I've had the honor to lead great teams, and one of the things that I'm most proud of is the careers that my past colleagues have forged, and I take deep pride in my alumni network, if you will, and you as educators, I know I appreciate that too. I think, look, curiosity, most important. That is not a very unique or satisfying answer, but it's actually a very difficult one to deliver on. Staying curious, particularly as you advance, and forcing yourself into situations that are unfamiliar to encourage that curiosity. back to my early thinking, taking you out of the familiar into the unfamiliar to push yourself to develop your curiosity. Second point, Rishi, is I believe execution is the ultimate differentiator. Get the work done. So many people, particularly in our industry, have great ideas, but success is about getting it done. Third thing from a career perspective is seek out great mentors and managers. A lot of my success is around the wonderful people I've worked with and around, but not just in the direct chain of command. People around you that you can learn from who have different backgrounds to yourself. Back to my own learning and my own blind spot, surround yourself with difference and always follow up.
That point is so important. You've made it twice, but it is a belter because people often leave things to chance. We've had Ash Jones was on, who only in following up with Steve Bartlett became his sidekick. You remember, Richard?
Yes.
Seeking out great mentors. Chance for you to shout out maybe one or two that have had a really big impact on you and why?
I think one of the first ones, Nitin Nourier. He was the dean of the Harvard Business School when I was a student there. And why I appreciate Nitin, Dean Nourier, was the fact that he put a lot of emphasis on soft skills. He taught a class called leadership. And many of my very skilled classmates thought that was the easy class because it was all about numbers and that was success. And I actually think the enduring skills that he imparted and encouraged me to develop were all in soft skills. And a lot of my success, to the extent I've had it, has been around developing soft skills. So he's been a really important mentor. I also had a wonderful boss, Frank McQuillan, who led Telecom Ireland when I was there many, many years ago. And why Frank was a wonderful mentor was because he was very different in skill set to myself. Frank was an engineer, introverted, deep thinking individual. I was a networker, a party planner, a hostess of the mostest. And what I loved about our working together was the complementarity of our skill sets. So those are two that are very different and very informal in their mentoring, but it was mostly through observation and learning from them that I benefited from a transfer of their skills.
You know, Margaret, you just touched on that one word there that really struck with me when you said it was observation. Because actually, all too often, we associate bosses and mentors as sort of having that direct sort of what they can impart on us. But the reality is the very smart people learn from people around you almost through osmosis. And I think that's what you've just sort of alluded to. And we are so much for the better of having Nitin and Frank in your life so we can benefit from some of the knowledge that you've just imparted.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I think it's core to my philosophy as a manager. I really believe in the apprenticeship model. And in the teams that I have led, I've created structures that encourage apprenticeship. I very much hire for attitude and train for aptitude or skill. And I believe in institutionalizing, creating structures for peer learning, for mentoring, and for internal teaching. So a lot of the processes that I would have created, whether it was very intentional offsites or Friday huddles that people share experiences, or modeling behavior myself and inviting colleagues to observe it, creating structures where it's not a small meeting where others can come purely as observer roles. So I believe in observation so profoundly that I transfer that thinking into apprenticeship modeling in the teams that I've worked with.
There you go. Now then, time has gone in a flash, so we're coming towards the end. So last question, I thought I'd end with a small one. The future of marketing. So there's probably nobody better placed to give a point of view on this. What does the future hold? You've already mentioned Gen AI. That might be part of the answer. But if I go as broad as you like, what's the future of marketing?
The future of marketing is the beginning of marketing. It comes back to listening to your stakeholders and acting on the insight that you pick up from that. It'll manifest in many different channels. There will be opportunity for technology. There will be opportunity for storytelling and inserting and combining humanity with the technology. The future is no different from the past. It's about listening and creating frameworks, methodologies, and processes that listen at scale. I think that's the future. Because when you listen, and only when you listen, to bring it back full circle, as you so always beautifully do in your synthesis, when you listen, only when you listen can you act effectively. So the future has to be in listening. And I think sometimes we all need, and I include myself in that, the reminder to do that more.
Gosh, how wonderful. And, I think the future is no different from our past. And the notion of truly listening to our stakeholders is absolutely the embryonic moment of what then creates the future of marketing in the industry. It's just how wonderful as a thought to leave us with. And I get the job of trying to do that synthesis. There we go, Margaret. So a little bit of circularity there. But it's been an absolutely wonderful session that we've had today. So many wonderful nuggets that you've shared. And let me see if I can do a little bit of justice to some of the key themes that have come and shone through. I love the notion that there's a spring in your step, by the way. It's fantastic. Possibilities in the air. An opportunity to absolutely reflect. But reflect on the way and the things that you truly want to learn about as you go through the next phase of your career. And there may be tactics that you may want to learn about, tools, techniques, technology, AI being one of them. But actually, the one thing that you've really honed in on and has shone through is the thought about becoming a better listener. Spending to ask the time to actually get the right questions in. And what struck me was your take on the role of listening, that it's actually the most generous gift that you can give to someone. And I think that's just wonderful. Now, as you get more senior in your career, it's often a stage where you start telling and answering. And so the biggest watch out that we all can have is that as we get more senior, to always think about how we can best listen. What I found remarkable is when you were that young gal getting off that plane and you stood foot in the States, you just said, I felt this is where I want to be. This is where I felt most at home. And I love that. I've always got this sort of irking desire to go over to the States one day and experience it for myself. So there we go. I've lived a little bit through you vicariously in this conversation here today. Maybe one day I will get that. But actually what's steered you through is the thought, and every career move that you had was around getting behind the mission. So whether it's representing Ireland on the internship programs, whether it's Telecom Ireland and actually helping drive employability in your home country, and then thereafter at Siegel+Gale in everything that you've done and the sort of brands and iconic brands you've worked with, it's all been in with a core thought around getting behind that mission. You went to Siegel+Gale around, again, back for the art of learning and learning the concepts around branding. And so why not go to the best place in the world to do so? As you would. And I love their mission as you described it. Simple is smart. And branding is a much more holistic thought than just the words, the pictures and the logos. It's about really representing the whole entire nexus of the customer. And as part of that, your entire thought process was about generating pride across that organization, recognizing that you were standing on the shoulders of giants and what had gone on before. Loved your take on networking, some wonderful advice that you've given us here today. But interestingly, there were some tangible things, but the thought around revealing your blind spots and having a diverse network was something that I really took away from that, and something I'm going to try and implement myself. You talked about the role of storytelling and specifically showing and telling, making the abstract into something tangible. I think that was just wonderful. Some great brands that you talked about around the concept of simplicity, and some great career advice when it comes to staying curious, put yourself in unfamiliar situations. Execution is the ultimate differentiator. Seek great mentors and always follow up. And the last thing that we talked around was this role of observation, to the point where you put that on the line and you really believe in the apprenticeship model, which I'm a big fan of. Hire for attitude and train for aptitude. So I hope I've done you justice, Margaret. It's been just truly wonderful to hear your insights. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you both. Very generous synthesis. What a treat. And thank you for everything you do for our industry in creating a context for so many wonderful marketers to tell their stories.